A black teen humiliated and kicked out of business class until the captain reveals his true identity. Hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to never miss our latest inspiring videos. The business class cabin of Delta Flight 472 from New York to Los Angeles was unusually quiet. Only the low hum of the engines and the soft rustle of papers filled the air. Ethan Carter, a 16-year-old black teenager, sat in seat 2A by the window. Crisp white shirt, Bose headphones loosely resting over his ears, eyes staring out into the blinding white clouds beyond the glass. He was just returning from a summer internship at a Manhattan tech company, the youngest intern ever accepted. His small carry-on sat neatly under the seat in front of him, a luggage tag with the airline's logo dangling in plain sight. But no one noticed. To them, Ethan was just another skinny black kid, a misfit in this refined space. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the brief furrowed glance from the man in seat 3C as Ethan had entered the cabin. But Ethan had long stopped caring until she arrived. "Excuse me, young man, this isn't your seat," the voice cut sharp through the aisle. Ethan turned his head and found himself face to face with a middle-aged white woman, about 50, blonde hair, a meticulously dyed lips, painted crimson, gold-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. She stood tall, arms folded, Chanel bag swinging lightly from her shoulder. She had introduced herself as Karen. Ethan had heard it when she boarded. "This is business class," she added, her tone more instruction than conversation. "You're in the wrong section. Economy's in the back." Ethan removed one headphone, met her eyes, didn't flinch. "I have a seat here, ma'am," he said, voice steady and low. Karen let out a short, derisive laugh. "A seat? You expect me to believe that? Who let you in here?" Whispers began bubbling from nearby rows. A white man in his 40s, dressed in a gray suit in seat 4B, muttered loud enough, "Kid probably snuck in. Someone check. Don't let him cause trouble." Another woman, pearl necklace glinting under cabin lights, glanced at Ethan, then turned to her friend and whispered, "Look at him. His clothes can't buy a single corner of this cabin." Ethan heard it all, each word like a knife. But he didn't move, didn't react. He pulled out his phone, opened the confirmation email, ready to show it. But Karen didn't wait. She lifted her hand and waved him off like swatting at a pest. "Go back now. Don't waste our time. I paid for peace and quiet, not for this." The air grew heavy. More eyes turned toward Ethan. Now he wasn't just a teenager in business class. He was the problem. Ethan's fingers dug lightly into the armrest. His nails bit into his palm. He remembered his father's words. "You don't owe them proof, son, but don't let them push you out of your place." He inhaled, lifted his head. "You want to check my ticket? I'll show you. But don't tell me I don't belong here." His voice wasn't loud, but it wasn't small anymore either. Karen blinked, caught off guard, then let out a loud laugh like she'd just heard the most ridiculous thing. "Belong? You think you belong here? This isn't a basketball court, kid." Her laughter echoed, joined by scattered snickers. A man in seat 5A, AirPods in his ears, shook his head. Kids these days. No sense of place. Ethan didn't look at them. His eyes locked on Karen's, steady. He knew if he lowered his head now, he wouldn't just lose a seat. He'd lose something much more. "Call the attendant." Ethan said, his tone calm but carved from stone. "They'll tell you whether I belong or not." Karen raised an eyebrow, as if surprised he was still talking. She turned and called out loud, "Flight attendant, we have a situation here." Footsteps hurried up the aisle. Ethan sat upright, phone still in hand, because he knew this wasn't just about a seat. This was about a young black boy's right to take up space in a place where they assumed he didn't deserve to be. The sharp click of heels echoed down the carpeted aisle of business class. Each step of the flight attendant, Melissa, signaling an unavoidable confrontation. In her early 30s, with a tight bun and a name tag that read Melissa, she arrived wearing a professional smile that didn't quite mask her nervous eyes. Karen immediately blocked her path. Finger pointed at Ethan. "Check his ticket. I didn't pay thousands of dollars to sit next to some kid who snuck in here." Ethan sat still. Phone clenched tightly in his hand, the boarding confirmation glowing clearly on the screen. He didn't look up right away, but each of Karen's words hit like a hammer to his chest. This wasn't the first time he'd been doubted, but the shamelessness of it, the public nature, made his heart pound harder. Melissa glanced at him, then at Karen, her tone calm but unsure. "I'll take care of it. Please stay calm." She stepped beside Ethan, hand out. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Ethan looked up, his gaze sharp but not hostile, and handed her the phone. Seat 2A, Ethan Carter. Valid ticket. Melissa scanned it, but before she could respond, Karen cut in sharply. You better check that carefully. These kids know how to fake things. Whispers stirred again. The man in 4B muttered. Probably a fake ticket happens all the time. A woman at 3D sipping wine added. If we allow this, anyone can just walk in. Ethan heard every word, felt every glance like needles against his skin. He took a deep breath, remembering his father's advice. Don't let emotion lead you. They'll use it against you. Melissa handed the phone back, hesitating. The ticket appears valid, but I need to verify with the system. Do you have any ID on you? Ethan furrowed his brow. ID? No one else here was asked for ID. Why me? His voice was steady but loud enough for the cabin to hear. Melissa froze, clearly not expecting pushback. Karen scoffed, turning to the other passengers. See that attitude? If he was legit, he'd show it without question. The air turned thick. A man in 5C leaned in. Come on, kid. Just show it. We're all waiting. Ethan looked at him, then at Melissa. His gaze had lost all signs of youth. It had sharpened into something far older. I've proven I belong here. If you need more confirmation, use your system, but don't ask me to prove more, just because she doesn't believe me. Karen stepped closer, hand on her hip. You think I don't believe you? I've flown business for 20 years and never seen someone like you up here. Her words, someone like you, cut through the air. A few passengers flinched. A young woman at 6A, brown-skinned, shook her head softly but stayed silent. Melissa looked flustered, stuck between Karen's entitlement and Ethan's unshakable calm. She turned to Karen, trying to pacify. Ma'am, please return to your seat. I will verify everything, but Karen refused to budge. She pointed again at Ethan, voice rising. No, I want him gone. If not, I'll call my lawyer. Ethan gave a dry laugh. Your lawyer, because I'm sitting in my assigned seat. Karen's face turned crimson. She snapped at Melissa. You heard that, and you still think he belongs here? Another passenger chimed in, a woman in pearls. Flight attendant, do something. We don't want delays over this. Melissa turned back to Ethan, voice shaky. Sir, I need your cooperation. Otherwise, I'll have to call the cabin supervisor. Ethan didn't blink. Call them, I'm not going anywhere. His tone was low and firm, every syllable a line drawn in the sand. The cabin fell into silence, the engine's hum suddenly louder than ever. Melissa turned and hurried to the rear, clearly seeking backup. Karen stood in place, gripping her handbag, eyes burning holes through Ethan. You'll regret challenging me, she said, voice low but seething. Ethan didn't respond. He looked back out the window where clouds drifted in soft layers, oblivious to the tension inside. But inside, he knew this wasn't the end of the confrontation. It was only the beginning, and he wasn't letting anyone push him out of the space he rightfully claimed. The business class cabin felt like a pressure cooker. The air was so thick, even the steady hum of the engines seemed swallowed whole. Ethan sat upright in seat 2A. His gaze locked on Karen, who stood firmly in the aisle arms, crossed lips, pressed tight like she was holding back a storm. The murmurs of passengers had turned into open criticism. The man in the gray suit at 4B muttered, wrong and stubborn. Must be poor parenting. The pearl-wearing woman at 3D added it bitterly. Just apologize and move. What's so hard? Ethan heard it all but didn't turn. Every word hit like a stone to the chest, but he had long learned how not to let them knock him down. He remembered being called a thief in class for mistakenly taking the wrong pen, and how he had swallowed that shame in silence. This time he wouldn't, sensing the defiance in Ethan's eyes. Karen stepped closer. Her voice was low but sharp as a blade. You think you're clever? You don't belong here, and everyone knows it. She glanced around, seeking agreement. A few nods, a couple of, she's right, whispered, feeding her pride like dry wood to flame. Ethan inhaled deeply, fingers gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to shout, to tell them he earned his spot here, that the internship in Manhattan wasn't luck, but sweat and sleepless nights. But he held it back. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Words only matter when used at the right moment, and his moment hadn't come yet. Then a new voice cut in. Enough, ma'am. He showed his ticket. Why are you still pressing this? A young woman in seat 6A, brown-skinned, high ponytail, round glasses, stood up, eyes locked on Karen. Can't you see you're making this a spectacle? Karen spun around, face flushed. Who are you to interfere? I paid for this seat in proper service not to watch people defend a disruptive kid. The word disruptive slapped the cabin silent. Ethan glanced at the girl, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes, but quickly returned his gaze to Karen. I'm not the one disrupting this cabin, he said, voice steady and cold. You are. Over what? That I'm black and sitting in business class? Ethan's words shot through the cabin like a bullet. A few passengers inhaled, some shook their heads. The man with glasses in 5C sneered. Oh, so now it's a race thing. You think everyone's out to get you? Ethan turned to him, voice unwavering. I don't think you're doing it right here, right now. The clarity and sharpness in his tone caught everyone off guard. Karen let out a forced laugh, but it lacked confidence. You're accusing me, I just want fairness. Fairness, Ethan snapped back. His voice now filled the cabin. Fairness is when you ask to see everyone's ticket, not just mine. Fairness is not looking at me like I don't belong because of my skin. He stood up taller than Karen, his eyes unflinching. The whole cabin held its breath. Melissa, the flight attendant, returned this time with a man in uniform. Cabin manager, Richard, printed on his name tag. He scanned the tense scene clearly, displeased. What's going on here, he asked, voice stern. Karen wasted no time. He doesn't belong here, ticket check isn't enough. I want him removed. But Ethan spoke first, looking directly at Richard. His voice was calm but heavy with purpose. I have a valid ticket booking number and every right to be here. If you need to verify, do it by protocol, but don't let her hijack this flight. Richard paused, clearly unaccustomed to a teenager speaking with such authority. Melissa whispered something to him, eyes flicking to Ethan. Karen, sensing momentum, pounced. See, even the crew isn't sure. Just get him off before I call my lawyer. The passengers began to divide. The girl in 6A shook her head louder this time. Can none of you see what's wrong here? He's done nothing wrong. But her voice was drowned out by a man in 7B. Ma'am, sit down. You're making it work. Ethan stood in the eye of it all, judged, doubted, yet unmoved. He felt every stare, some cruel, some cautious, and a few quietly supportive. He knew that if he bowed now, he'd always be the one who didn't belong. Call the captain, Ethan said, voice clear and commanding. I want this resolved properly. Karen scoffed, but her eyes flickered with unease. Richard nodded to Melissa. All right, I'll notify the captain. Ethan sat back down, but his eyes never left Karen. He knew this was no longer about a seat. It was about whether people like him, young black, unapologetically present, had the right to exist in spaces others tried to gatekeep. The business class cabin had become a stage, and all eyes were locked on Ethan and Karen, the two unwilling leads of a drama no one expected aboard Delta Flight 472. Cabin manager Richard, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a stiff gait, stood in the aisle trying to contain the situation, though his eyes betrayed his confusion. Behind him, flight attendant Melissa clutched her notepad tightly, waiting for clear instructions. Karen, her face flushed with anger, kept jabbing her finger toward Ethan, nearly shouting, I told you he doesn't belong here. Why is he still in that seat? I want the captain down here now. Ethan, still in seat 2A, was no longer the quiet kid they'd seen minutes ago. He stood taller than Karen and met her furious gaze with one sharper than a blade. You want the captain, fine, but you're going to have to explain why you turned this entire cabin into chaos just because I sat in the seat. I paid for. His words cut like a cold gust through the cabin. A few passengers stiffened. The young brown-skinned woman in 6A nodded approvingly, her eyes filled with support. But her voice was drowned by the man in the gray suit at 4B, now standing tone authoritative. That's enough, kid. You're delaying this flight. If you won't cooperate, we'll call security. Ethan turned to him without flinching. Cooperate? I've shown my ticket, my booking number. What else do you want? Should I kneel and apologize for daring to sit in business class? His words struck like a whip, and the suited man hesitated, lips moving but no reply forming. Sensing the shift, Karen pulled out her phone and began recording. You want to make this big? Fine, I'll post this online and let the world see how disruptive you are. Ethan laughed, not with humor but disbelief. Go ahead, just make sure to include the part where you called me the kind of person who doesn't belong here. He emphasized the words kind of person, and Karen flinched. Her hand trembled slightly. Whispers stirred again across the cabin, some disapproving, some uncertain. The pearl-wearing woman at 3D shook her head and whispered, kids today have no respect. But the woman in 6A had had enough. She stood again louder this time. What's the video for? To smear him. Can't you all see this is discrimination? The air in the cabin was thick, seconds from boiling over. Richard raised his hand, voice raised in an attempt to restore order. Everyone, please calm down. We're verifying the information. You, Ethan, right? I need you to temporarily leave the seat while we sort this out. Ethan shook his head, voice low but steady. Temporarily leave for what? So she can feel better. I'm not going anywhere. You have the system. You have the passenger manifest. Do your job. His words landed like a slap. Richard frowned, clearly not used to being challenged by a teenager. Karen seized the moment, turning to him again. See that attitude? I demand the captain now, or I'll sue this airline. Before anyone could respond, another voice rose from seat 7C. An older white man in a simple sweater, silver hair, stood and said calmly, he hasn't done anything wrong. You have checked his ticket. Why not just leave him alone if this is how people were treated? Who'd ever want to fly again? A few nods followed. Karen, sensing her control slipping, snapped back. You don't understand. This is about safety. Who knows who this kid is or where he came from? That was the final trigger. Ethan stepped fully into the aisle, facing Karen directly. His voice rang out loud and steady. You want to know who I am? I'm Ethan Carter. I'm 16. I interned at a tech firm in Manhattan this summer. I'm sitting here because I earned it, not because I snuck in or stole anything. And you, who are you to think you have the right to throw me out? The cabin went silent. Karen froze, her eyes flickering. Richard, sensing the situation had spiraled beyond his control, turned to Melissa. Get the captain now. Melissa nodded and walked briskly toward the cockpit. Ethan remained standing, aware of every stare, some still laced with prejudice, others shifting, questioning, even respectful. He knew this moment was no longer just about a seat. It was about him, a young black teen standing up against a room full of doubt to defend his right to simply exist. Karen, still clinging to a veneer of defiance, tightened her grip on her designer bag. Her eyes now avoided Ethan's, but he never looked away. He knew the end of this battle was near, and he wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. Business class on Delta Flight 472 had become an arena. Every glance, every word charged with the weight of an invisible battle. 16-year-old Ethan Carter, a young black teen, stood in the aisle beside seat 2A. His gaze unwavering, even as his chest pounded like it might break through his ribs. Karen, the middle-aged white woman with styled blonde hair and a Chanel bag clutched like a weapon, remained firmly planted, her face red with fury but her eyes showing the first signs of uncertainty. Richard, the cabin manager, tried to maintain calm, but his voice trembled slightly as he said, Ethan, we need you to cooperate. Just move to economy for now. While we verify things, it's for the benefit of everyone. Ethan shook his head, his voice low but razor sharp. Benefit for who? For her. He nodded subtly toward Karen, who stiffened at the remark. Karen fired back immediately, voice sharp and escalating. He's challenging the entire airline. If no one handles this, I'll make sure the media hears about it. She turned toward the other passengers, scanning for support. The man in the gray suit in 4B chimed in. We didn't pay to watch a kid disrupt the flight. But not everyone nodded. The young woman in 6A, the one who had spoken up earlier, stood again, voice rising with frustration. Disrupt. He's defending himself. You're all ganging up on a kid and calling it order. Her words landed like a stone, dropped into a still pond, ripples of discomfort spreading silently through the cabin. Karen scoffed, voice thick with condescension. What rights does he have when he clearly doesn't belong here? Ethan took each word like a knife to the chest but didn't flinch. He'd been here before, in stores, in schools, in places where people looked at him and decided he didn't fit. But this time he wasn't going to shrink back. Did you check anyone else's ticket? He said, voice steady and clear enough to cut through the air. Or just mine, because I'm the only black person in this cabin. Silence dropped like a curtain. Even Richard faltered. Karen didn't answer. She turned instead to Richard, her voice lowering, but growing more venomous. You heard him. If you don't do something, I'll have legal action on your hands. Richard held up a hand to calm her. We're waiting for the captain. But Ethan, please just cooperate for now. Ethan let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Not amused, just fed up. Cooperate means, what step down, so she wins. You're taking the easy route. Eject me to avoid upsetting your regulars, Melissa. The flight attendant lowered her gaze. The woman in 6A stood taller. He's right. If his ticket checks out, why should he move? This is public bias, plain and simple. Her voice was drowned out by a man shouting from 7B. Enough. Get him out so we can take off, sensing momentum. Karen lifted her phone and started filming her expression. Smug. Want to be a hero? Let's show the world how you behave. Ethan didn't flinch. He looked straight into the lens. Go ahead. Just make sure you include the part where you called me the kind that doesn't belong. Included the part where you demanded I be removed for sitting in my rightful seat. Her hand trembled slightly. From 7C, the older white man who had spoken earlier added, filming him to shame him for standing his ground. Aren't you ashamed? Karen ignored it, turning to Richard again. You do nothing, I'll ruin your airline. Ethan stood firm, the weight of every judgment, every slur, every silence pressing down, but he didn't waver. He locked eyes with Richard. I'm not moving. If you want me out, call security. But if you do, you'll regret it. The words hung like thunder. Richard turned to Melissa, visibly shaken. Call the captain. Now Melissa nodded and headed toward the cockpit, leaving Ethan standing alone but unshaken between glances of contempt, whispers of doubt, and the quiet approval of those too afraid to speak louder. But Ethan knew this moment was bigger than Seat 2A. It was about him and his right to exist without needing permission. Business class on Delta Flight 472 felt like a pressure cooker about to blow. Every glance, every word, added another drop to the thick tension hanging in the air. 16-year-old Ethan Carter stood beside Seat 2A, eyes locked on Karen. The middle-aged woman with styled blonde hair and an unwavering air of entitlement. Cabin supervisor Richard stood between them, visibly tense, caught between Karen's demands and Ethan's quiet defiance. Melissa, the flight attendant, had just left to alert the captain, leaving behind a deadly silence broken only by the drone of the engine and hushed whispers. Sensing the mood shifting, Karen raised her phone higher and began filming her expression. Triumphant. You wanted to make a scene. Let's see how you explain this once it goes viral. Ethan stared straight into the lens, his voice low but sharp. Go ahead. Just make sure you include the part where you insulted me, tried to force me out of my seat because of my skin color. Show them how you turned me into a threat just for daring to sit here. His words swept through the cabin like a gust of cold air. A few passengers froze. The young woman of color in 6A, who had defended him earlier, stood again, voice rising with outrage. She's recording him to humiliate him. Don't any of you see how wrong this is? Her voice was quickly drowned out by the man in the gray suit at 4B, now visibly irritated. Enough, kid. You're delaying the entire flight. Just leave already. Ethan turned to face him, his stare steady. Delaying? I didn't start this. You all want me gone because you can't stand seeing a black teenager in business class. The words hit like a bomb. The entire cabin fell silent. Even Karen wavered slightly, though she quickly masked it with another forced smirk. Don't play the race card. I just want fairness, she shouted, but her voice was beginning to tremble. Ethan let out a cold laugh, dry without amusement. Fairness? You want fairness? Then why not check his ticket too? He pointed at the man in the gray suit. Or hers, he added, nodding toward the pearl necklace woman in 3D, who quickly averted her eye. I'm the only one who got checked, filmed, labeled as an intruder. That's your idea of fair. His voice rang out, cutting through the self-righteous silence. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, as if seeing the injustice in their own behavior for the first time. The elderly man in 7C who had spoken earlier nodded solemnly. The boy's right. This has gone too far, and it's all based on your own prejudice. Leave him alone. But Karen wouldn't stop. She stepped closer to Ethan, voice low and laced with threat. Who do you think you are? A kid like you sitting here. Who even paid for your ticket? Surely not you. Ethan took a deep breath. A strange light flashed in his eyes. Resolve history in something deeper. He thought of his father working late into the night of tense boardroom negotiations to build a company no one saw coming. He looked Karen in the eye and replied, calm but full of weight. You want to know who paid for it? My father. And he didn't just pay for this seat. He invests in flights like this. He invests in airlines like this. His words fell like a stone into a still pond, making ripples. No one could ignore. Karen scoffed, but her smile cracked at the edges. Your father, don't be ridiculous. A kid like you. Your father can't afford this. Ethan didn't answer. He just looked at her, and that gaze alone made her instinctively take a half step back. The woman in 6A leaned forward, curiosity in her voice. Wait, are you serious? Who's your dad? Ethan shook his head. You don't need to know. But I'd suggest, he said, turning to Karen again, you stop now before this goes somewhere. You can't pull back from. His words hung in the air like a warning, making Richard frown. Doubt was creeping in. The man in the gray suit mumbled, probably bluffing. Check it. Don't fall for it. But others began to murmur questions, rising glances shifting toward Ethan with new uncertain respect. Karen, sensing her grip slipping, snapped, don't believe him. He's just distracting you. I want the captain here, now. Richard nodded, voice tight. The captain has been notified. Everyone, please remain calm. But no one was calm. Ethan stood tall, his gaze moving deliberately across each face. The seed of doubt had been planted. And when the truth arrived, he knew it would silence every last one of them. Business class on Delta Flight 472 now felt like a live wire, one spark away from exploding. The tension was so heavy, even the hum of the engine seemed drowned out. 16-year-old Ethan Carter stood firmly in the aisle beside seat 2AA, his sharp gaze fixed on Karen, the blonde middle-aged woman whose smug confidence was now tinged with unease. Cabin supervisor Richard stood between them, hand raised in an attempt to calm the situation, though his trembling voice betrayed the pressure bearing down from both Karen and Ethan's unwavering stance. Around them, the cabin had split into two camps, one supporting Karen, loudly demanding the boy be removed, and the other smaller, but growing, beginning to question everything after Ethan's mention of his father. Sensing the crowd shifting, Karen doubled down. She raised her phone again, not to record this time, but to make a call. Her voice rang out, nearly shrieking, I'm calling my lawyer right now, and I want the captain here immediately. This airline will pay if you don't remove him. Ethan didn't move. His eyes never left Karen, though his chest was pounding hard enough to shake him from within. He remembered every time he'd been doubted, pushed aside because of the color of his skin, in classrooms and stores and places he had every right to belong. But this time he wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been treated as if they were out of place. You want the captain? Ethan said, his voice low but clear, rising above the growing whispers. Fine, but you'd better be ready to explain yourself when he gets here, because I'm not going anywhere. His words landed like a strike of lightning. Karen flinched, eyes flickering with uncertainty. She turned to Richard, voice sharp with threat. Did you hear that? He's challenging the entire airline. If the captain doesn't take care of this, I'll make sure the media does. Caught in the crossfire. Richard turned to the passengers, trying to restore order. Everyone, please remain calm. The captain will be here shortly. We'll follow procedure, but calm was no longer an option. The man in the gray suit at 4B shouted, What procedure? Move the kid to economy already. We didn't pay for this drama. From 6A, the young woman of color stood again, defiant. Drama. You were bullying a kid because of your prejudice. If he has a valid ticket, why won't you just let him be? Her words made a few people go quiet, but Karen refused to back down. She stepped closer to Ethan, hands on hips, voice lowered to a venomous edge. You think you're clever. You and your so-called father, if he even exists, don't belong here. The slap of her words rang out in the cabin. Silence fell for a beat. Ethan inhaled deeply, his fingers gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to shout, to tell them his father had built an empire from nothing, that he was one of the airline's major shareholders, but not yet. The time would come. Instead, he met Karen's gaze and said slowly but with weight, You know nothing about me or my father, but you will. And when you do, you'll regret what you said today. The quiet power in his words made Karen step back just half a pace, but enough. From 7C, the older man who had spoken before called out, Son, who is your father? If you're telling the truth, we'll stand with you. But Ethan shook his head, eyes steady. You don't need to know. The truth will speak for itself. Just then, another flight attendant appeared from the back, this time a black woman in her 40s with a name tag that read Janice. She had been watching quietly from the start, her sharp eyes scanning Ethan, Karen, and then Richard. Unlike Melissa, Janice didn't speak. She simply pulled out a tablet, fingers gliding quickly over the screen. She leaned toward Richard and whispered something, his brow furrowed, eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced at Ethan. Karen noticed the shift and shouted, See, they're checking. He'll be thrown out any minute, but Janice didn't answer. She looked at Ethan. There was something in her gaze, something soft and understanding, as if she recognized exactly what he was going through. She turned back to the tablet, scrolled for another moment, then calmly walked toward the cockpit without saying a word. Ethan remained standing, absorbing the heat of judgment from all sides. Contemptuous stares, sharp-edged words, and the silence of those too afraid to speak. But he didn't flinch. He knew Janice was doing something that mattered. He could feel the shift. Karen, still trying to appear composed, tightened her grip on her designer bag, her eyes no longer meeting his. The whole cabin held its breath, waiting for the next move, when suddenly the sound of polished shoes striking the floor echoed from the front. Heavy, deliberate, the captain was on his way. The heavy footsteps emerging from the cockpit echoed like war drums down the aisle of Delta Flight 472's business class, pulling the entire cabin into a breathless silence. 16-year-old Ethan Carter stood tall beside seat 2A, his gaze locked on Karen, the blonde middle-aged woman whose smug poise was now fraying at the edges. Cabin manager Richard stood between them, hands slightly trembling despite trying to appear composed, his eyes betraying growing unease. Karen, noticing the captain's approach, straightened up, finger pointed at Ethan, her voice shrill and righteous. "Finally, I want this boy removed immediately. I didn't pay thousands of dollars to sit next to a troublemaker." Ethan said nothing, but his eyes sliced clean through her composure. He knew this moment would decide everything, not just a seat, but whether he could stand tall in a world constantly trying to push him down. Captain Daniel Harris entered the cabin. Mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, his Navy uniform crisp, the gold wings on his chest catching the overhead lights. His name tag read Captain D. Harris. He walked in with quiet authority, his eyes sweeping across the rows, settling briefly on Ethan, then on Karen. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but commanding, cutting through the cabin's tension like a scalpel. Karen jumped in instantly, finger jabbing toward Ethan. "That boy doesn't belong here," I asked, for a ticket. "Check," and he refused. "He's been disrupting the entire cabin." "Remove him now." From 4B, the man in the gray suit chimed in, puffed up with indignation. "Exactly. We won't tolerate delays over a kid." But from 6A, the young woman of color stood again, voice rising in anger. "He has a valid ticket. You're bullying him because of his skin color. Captain, you need to step in." Ethan didn't move. He locked eyes with Captain Harris, breathing slowly, hearing his father's words echo in his mind. "When the world turns against you, let truth speak louder." He took a step forward, voice steady but clear. "Sir, I have a valid ticket, booking confirmation and ID. I gave everything to the flight crew, but she..." He nodded toward Karen, "and others refused to believe me, because I'm the only black passenger in this cabin. I didn't cause a scene, they did." His words struck like a bullet, forcing a few passengers to lower their eyes. Karen, however, refused to back down. "He's lying. He even made up a story about his father saying his dad paid for this seat. A kid like him." "Who does? He think his father is some billionaire?" Captain Paris raised a hand. "That's enough," he said, firm and measured. Turning to Ethan, he asked, "Do you have anything to support your claim?" Ethan nodded, pulled out his phone, and opened his email confirmation. "Here's seat 2A. Ethan Carter, valid reservation. I can show my passport too if needed." Harris took the phone, scanned the screen, but before he could say anything, Karen interrupted again. "Check it thoroughly. God knows what he forged. Just get him off this plane." Ethan let out a cold laugh, staring directly at her. "Forgery. You think I faked a ticket just to sit here and be insulted by you? You should be more worried about yourself, because the truth's about to come out." Just then, Janice, the black flight attendant, who had been quietly watching, stepped forward from the rear of the cabin. She didn't speak. She simply handed a tablet to Captain Harris and whispered something in his ear. He furrowed his brow, his eyes flickering toward Ethan with a hint of surprise. He turned to Richard and said in a low voice, "Confirm the manifest." Now Richard nodded, fumbling for his headset. Karen, sensing the shift, snapped, "Why are we confirming anything? He's clearly the one causing trouble. Just remove him." But Harris ignored her. His eyes remained on Ethan, and this time they carried something different, not suspicion, something closer to curiosity. Ethan stood his ground, feeling the weight of every stare, judgmental, dismissive, and a few beginning to shift. He knew Janice had found something. The truth was near. The young woman at 6A leaned toward the passenger beside her and whispered, "He's not lying. Something bigger's going on." The older man in 7C nodded solemnly. "Told you, people are too quick to judge." Karen's grip tightened on her designer purse. Her eyes began to dart. Her voice for once fell silent. The entire cabin held its breath. Then Richard's headset crackled to life, a confirmation signal. Everyone turned toward the captain, waiting for the moment that would change everything. Business class on Delta Flight 472 now felt like a ticking bomb, one spark away from detonation. 16-year-old Ethan Carter stood firm in the aisle beside seat 2A, his heartbeat pounding as he met the stares around him, disdainful, suspicious, and a few laced with curiosity. Captain Daniel Harris, imposing in his Navy uniform, stood at the center of the cabin holding the tablet Janice had handed him. His eyes scanned the screens, slowly shifting from surprise to something heavier. Karen, the blonde, middle-aged woman who'd ignited the chaos, tried to maintain her usual smug expression, but her eyes flickered with unease as she noticed the change in Harris's face. She raised her voice, finger jabbing toward Ethan. "You see that? He's the one causing all this. Remove him now, or I swear I'll sue this airline." But her tone lacked the certainty it once carried, like she too sensed a storm approaching. Harris raised a hand for silence, his gaze slicing through Karen before settling on Ethan. "You're Ethan Carter." His voice was low, but carried a weight that silenced the entire cabin. Ethan nodded, eyes steady. "Yes, sir, and I have a valid ticket booking reference. Everything they asked for, I've done nothing wrong." Harris gave a small nod, eyes still glued to the tablet, like whatever he was reading required careful consideration. He turned to Richard, the cabin manager, and asked in a low tone, "Did you check the manifest yet? Is he on the VIP list?" The question hit like a bullet. Richard froze, fumbling with his device. Karen, overhearing the word VIP, scoffed loudly, though her laugh sounded hollow. "VIP? Him? You must be joking. A kid like that? How could he possibly be VIP?" Ethan remained still, gaze locked with the captain's. He remembered the stories his father used to tell him about building something from nothing. How no one believed a black man could hold major shares in an airline. "They'll always doubt you, Ethan," his father once said. "But truth is louder than any voice." Ethan took a breath. "You don't need to check the VIP list," he said calmly. "Just scan my booking, that'll tell you who I am." His words caused a visible ripple in the cabin. The young woman in 6A leaned to the passenger beside her and whispered, "He's not lying. Something's going on here." The older man in 7C nodded. "Told you don't judge too fast." Karen, sensing the shift, stepped closer to the captain, voice rising into near desperation. "Don't let him manipulate you. He's been rude, disruptive. He insulted me. I've been flying business class for 20 years. I deserve better." Harris didn't respond. He glanced toward Janice, the black flight attendant, standing silently at the rear of the cabin. Her expression urged him. Read it again. He swiped through the tablet one last time, then looked up, and something in his eyes had changed. He turned to Ethan. "You said your father paid for the ticket. I need you to confirm his name right now." The entire cabin froze. Ethan took a deep breath, glancing once at Karen before turning back to Harris. He knew this was the moment. "James Carter." He said, voice clear and deliberate. The name dropped like a bomb. Harris's brow furrowed, recognition flickering instantly. Janice behind him gave the faintest of nods, her eyes betraying a quiet, knowing smile. Karen laughed loud and forced. "James Carter? Who even is that? What kind of man could afford to buy this brat a seat in business class?" But her laughter faded fast when Harris raised a hand, voice heavy with certainty. "James Carter, the largest shareholder in Delta Airlines." Silence fell. Karen froze, fingers clutching her handbag so tightly her knuckles went white. The man in 4B whispered, "No way." The woman in 6A gave a soft chuckle, eyes wide with newfound respect. Ethan didn't flinch. He met the captain's gaze and nodded. "That's right, and I'm his son." The cabin went silent again, broken only by the soft drone of the engines. The truth was no longer avoidable, but this battle wasn't over yet. The business class cabin of Delta Flight 472 had fallen into a heavy silence, as if the world had stopped spinning. Captain Daniel Harris's confirmation, "James Carter, the largest shareholder of Delta Airlines," still echoed in everyone's mind, replacing the suffocating tension with a thick fog of guilt and shame. 16-year-old Ethan Carter stood tall beside seat 2A, his eyes scanning the crowd from Karen, now visibly trembling, to the passengers who had earlier scoffed at his presence. Karen, clutching her Chanel handbag so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, opened her mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. She took a small step back, eyes flicking between the captain and Richard, silently pleading for help, but no one moved. The truth had sliced through her self-righteous facade like a blade. Harris, still holding his authority like a mantle, looked at Ethan with a new glimmer of respect. before turning to Karen, voice steady and sharp. You asked for verification and we did our job. Mr. Ethan Carter not only holds a valid ticket, he is the son of Mr. James Carter, Delta's largest shareholder. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Karen froze, her lips parting, but all she managed was a faint stutter. I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? She looked desperately around the cabin for support, but no one met her eyes. The man in the gray suit at 4B, once the loudest voice against Ethan, now stared down at his tie. The woman with the pearl necklace at 3D quietly turned away, her untouched glass of wine trembling slightly on the tray. Ethan stood in the center of the silence, feeling it settle over the cabin like a victory, but not the one he had hoped for. He didn't want them to fear him because of who his father was. He wanted them to reflect on what they had done. He took a breath, voice low but clear. I didn't need my father to prove I deserved to sit here. I had a ticket, I followed every rule. I did everything right. And yet all of you, his eyes swept across the faces, landing briefly on Karen. Then others saw me as someone who didn't belong. A liar, a threat, just because of my skin color? That's not on me, that's on you. His words landed like a slap and the cabin froze again. The young woman in 6A nodded with quiet admiration and whispered, Well said. The older man in 7C gave a light clap, his raspy voice adding, You make me proud, son. Karen, stripped of her smugness, tried to defend herself, her voice cracking. I just wanted to feel safe. I didn't mean to offend. He was being difficult, But Harris cut her off, his tone firm and unflinching. You offended him, not just with your words, but with your actions. You filmed him. You threatened him. You tried to have him removed because you couldn't imagine a black teenager legitimately sitting in business class. That's not about safety. That's prejudice. His words were a verdict. Karen stepped back, her face pale. She collapsed into her seat, covering her face with both hands, like she could hide from every stare in the cabin. Janice, the flight attendant, who had quietly confirmed everything, stepped toward Ethan. Her eyes were warm but unwavering. You okay? She asked softly. Ethan nodded, but his gaze stayed fixed on the cabin. The truth was out, but the sting of their judgment still lingered. He turned to Harris, voice calm but deliberate. I don't want her to apologize. That won't change anything. I just want everyone here to remember today, not because of who my father is, but because of how wrong they were. His words hung in the air like smoke. Harris nodded slowly, his expression now filled with respect. He turned to Richard. Make sure Mr. Carter is treated properly. From now until we land, I want a full report of this incident. The cabin remained silent, the engines humming a steady backdrop. Ethan sat back in seat 2A, his eyes drifting to the window where layers of clouds slid gently past. He knew this battle was over, but the larger one, the fight against prejudice, still waited beyond the horizon. And he was ready. The business class cabin of Delta Flight 472 now resembled a still painting after a storm of calm on the surface, but with the weight of truth still hanging in the air. Ethan Carter, the 16-year-old black teenager, sat silently in seat 2A, eyes fixed on the clouds drifting beyond the window. Though his mind was still spinning with everything that had just happened, Captain Daniel Harris stood in the aisle, his sharp gaze sweeping across the cabin from Karen, who now kept her head bowed and her hands covering her face, to the other passengers who had previously mocked Ethan and now avoided each other's eye. Flight attendant Janice stood quietly at the back, her warm eyes steady, tablet still in hand, a silent witness to Ethan's quiet victory. Harris turned to Richard, his voice low but firm. I want everything documented by the book. Mrs. Karen will need to provide a statement. When we land, I want a full report sent to company management. Karen, upon hearing her name, lifted her head, face pale, lips trembling. Statement, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to ensure safety. She turned to the other passenger's voice, nearly pleading. You saw it too. He was confrontational. I was just protecting my rights, but no one answered. The man in the gray suit at 4B, who had earlier demanded Ethan's removal, now sat in silence, nervously toying with his tie. The woman with the pearl necklace at 3D quietly set down her untouched wine glass, as if trying to erase any trace of her complicity. The young woman in 6A, who had stood up for Ethan all along, chuckled quietly, whispering to her seatmate, She's still trying to justify it. That's embarrassing. The older man in 7C nodded, his voice gravelly. That boy just taught us all a lesson. Ethan heard every word, but he didn't turn around. He didn't want to look at Karen or any of them. He thought of the many times he had been questioned, pushed aside or eyed with suspicion at school and stores, in spaces where he should have been treated as an equal. But this time he had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't belong. He took a slow breath, his voice calm but weighted. I don't want her punished. Punishing her won't fix anything. But I want all of you to remember today, not because of who my father is, but because of how you looked at me, judged me before you knew the truth. That's what needs fixing. Not me. His words landed like a declaration, and the cabin fell still. Harris nodded, his eyes now filled with respect. You're right, Ethan, and I'm sorry for what you've endured. This airline does not tolerate discrimination, and will make sure this doesn't happen again. He turned to Karen, his tone turning cold. You will be required to speak with security upon landing, and I suggest you reflect on your actions. Karen, now stripped of all composure, slumped into her seat, covering her face again, unable to meet anyone's eyes. A few passengers murmured quietly, but no one dared speak up loudly. The air in the cabin had shifted, not tense but heavy with reflection. Janice stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You did good, she whispered, her voice that of an older sister, proud, protective. Ethan nodded but kept his gaze distant. He didn't feel victorious, just exhausted. Exhausted from having to prove he belonged. Exhausted by suspicion. The young woman from 6A approached, voice soft but genuine. Thank you. You spoke for more people than you know. Ethan offered a faint smile for the first time during the entire flight, but it faded quickly. He knew this battle was over, but the war against prejudice was far from won. Harris motioned to Richard and Janice to resume their duties, then turned back to Ethan. If you need anything, just ask. This seat is yours and no one has the right to take it from you. Ethan nodded, sinking into his seat again, eyes drifting back toward the window and the soft clouds beyond. He knew the truth had prevailed, but his worth was never about who his father was. It was about how he stood up, faced a room full of doubt, and made them see themselves for who they truly were. The business class cabin of Delta Flight 472 was now as still as a chapel after service, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts and averted gazes. Ethan Carter, the 16-year-old black teenager, sat in seat 2A, eyes gazing out the window, where layers of white clouds had begun to glow orange in the light of sunset. He didn't feel victorious, only a quiet relief tinged with exhaustion, relief that the truth had been revealed. Exhaustion from having to fight just to prove he belonged. Captain Daniel Harris, after instructing cabin manager Richard and flight attendant Janice to handle the aftermath, returned to Ethan's row and spoke with quiet sincerity. You did the right thing. If you need anything, just say the word. Ethan nodded without replying. He didn't need comfort. He needed the world to change. Karen, the middle-aged woman who had demanded his removal, now sat curled in seat 3C, her hands covering her face, her once proud Chanel handbag now slumped in her lap. She didn't look up. She couldn't. Harris had already informed her she'd be required to meet with airport security upon arrival in Los Angeles, and that a full report would be filed with airline management. Several of the passengers who had once backed her, the man in the gray suit at 4B and the pearl-wearing woman at 3D, now kept their heads down as if trying to erase their complicity. The young woman in 6A, who had stood by Ethan from the beginning, stepped toward him and said softly, warmly, You were incredible. Thank you for not backing down. Ethan smiled faintly for the first time during the flight, but there was a bitterness to it. I didn't have a choice, he said. If I'd bowed my head, they would have thought they were right. The elderly man in 7C with silver hair and kind eyes rose from his seat and offered Ethan a handshake. You remind me of my son, he said, his voice raspy. He's been treated the same way just because of his skin. You taught all of us something today. Ethan shook his hand, feeling the sincerity in the gesture, but he didn't want to be celebrated. He turned to Harris and spoke slowly. I don't want her fired. That won't change anything. I just want people to understand that no one deserves to be treated like I was today, not because of who their father is, but because we're all human. Harris nodded, respect evident in his eyes. You've got a big heart, Ethan. I'll make sure that lesson doesn't get lost, Janice. The black flight attendant approached and placed a glass of orange juice on Ethan's tray. For you, she said, her eyes full of pride like an older sister. You did better than anyone I've ever seen. Ethan nodded his thanks, but his gaze remained distant. He thought of his father, who had deliberately sent him on this flight alone, without the protection of a name or status, so he could face the world for what it was. They will doubt you, his father had once said, but you must stand firm, and today Ethan had done just that. The plane began its descent and the usual landing announcement echoed through the cabin, but no one said a word. No one smiled, no one took videos, no one whispered. When the wheels touched down, Ethan stood, lifted his small suitcase and walked out of the cabin in silence. Karen, escorted by 2 security officers, didn't look at him. A few passengers, like the young woman from 6A and the elderly man from 7C, nodded to him respectfully as he passed. Ethan didn't respond. He walked into the airport where his father, James Carter, was waiting. James didn't ask anything. He simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. "You did well," he said. Ethan nodded, his gaze firm. He knew this flight wasn't just a journey, it was a turning point, a moment where he learned to stand tall, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed to the margins. And he would never forget that lesson. Ethan stood up against prejudice, silencing an entire plane with the truth. Thank you for watching. Please share this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to catch our next inspiring story.